One of the most disturbing cases of family isolation and inbreeding ever documented in the United States was revealed to the public on September 27, 1981, in Owsley County, Kentucky. Nestled in the heart of the Appalachians, Owsley was already recognized as one of America's poorest counties, a place where families had lived for generations in isolated valleys, cut off from the wider world by impossible mountains and roads that turned inaccessible during the harsh winters. On that particular day, a state social services team was making routine visits to unregistered properties under a fine drizzle that veiled the mountains in mist when they discovered a deteriorated house in the region known as La Rose. The property sat almost 5 miles from the main road, reachable only by a dirt path that twisted between pine trees and century-old oaks. What they discovered would forever alter the silent history of that valley. The house itself was a wooden structure, darkened by time, with no real windows, only openings covered by pieces of plastic and cardboard. The roof showed obvious holes, and the surrounding land was overtaken by tall weeds and rust. But the first thing that caught the social worker's attention was the unusual silence. Even at the most isolated properties, there were always sounds: chickens, an old radio, conversations. Here, the silence felt like its own entity. An elderly-looking woman, later identified as 72-year-old Martha Bram, answered their knock. She tried to block the team from entering, but the powerful odor coming from inside, combined with the woman's visibly debilitated state, justified immediate intervention. Inside that home, which had no electricity or running water, lived 6 people: Martha, her daughter Eloise Bram, 49, and 4 younger women who would later be identified as Eloise's daughters. These 4 women, roughly between 18 and 30 years old, displayed alarming physical characteristics: asymmetrical faces, severe strabismus, prominent jaws, and most notably, a clear difficulty with communication. None of them spoke clearly, only making guttural sounds and rudimentary phrases that seemed understandable only to them. The scene was striking even for the most seasoned social workers. In their official reports, they described how the women moved through the space like ghosts, apparently without fully recognizing our presence. Their movements were uncoordinated, and they all showed repetitive mannerisms, such as continuously rocking back and forth. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any records. None of the 4 women possessed a birth certificate, school record, or any official document. It was as if they did not exist to the world beyond those walls. This case would prove to be just the start of unearthing a history of inbreeding that stretched back for decades, an invisible cycle of isolation, abuse, and neglect that resulted in one of the clearest examples of the devastating effects of continued family crossbreeding. As the authorities struggled to comprehend what they were seeing, the 4 sisters Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, names they would be given later since they had no official identities, remained seated on the dirt floor, as if this interruption to their routine was merely a brief inconvenience in a lifetime of silence. The true story of these women, however, had started much earlier, in another era of Kentucky, when geographical and cultural isolation created the perfect setting for a family to close in on itself for generations. If you want to follow more cases like this, ones that shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. Following the initial discovery, county authorities were confronted with an unprecedented challenge: how to investigate a situation where there were practically no records, no external witnesses, or any formal documentation. The 4 women were immediately transported to Cumberland Valley Regional Hospital for medical evaluation, while Eloise and Martha were taken into custody. The first medical reports, dated September 30, 1981, revealed an alarming picture. The 4 sisters displayed a series of physical and cognitive characteristics compatible with what doctors of the time called degeneration from inbreeding. Dr. Robert Harkins, the head of the medical team, noted in his confidential report, "We are confronting a case where family endogamy appears to have occurred over multiple generations, resulting in the classic manifestations of accumulated recessive disorders." The investigation into the family history encountered significant obstacles from the start. Martha Bram refused to cooperate, insisting that family matters were nobody's business. The little information she did offer was contradictory and vague. Eloise, for her part, showed limited cognitive capacity and clear signs of profound psychological trauma. It was through parish records from the local Baptist church and testimonies from distant neighbors that investigators slowly began piecing together the macabre puzzle of the Bram lineage. The first clues pointed to a history dating back to the 1920s, when William Bram, Eloise's father, settled in that isolated region after leaving a mining community in Harland County. One of the most crucial testimonies came from Joseph Miller, then 83 years old, who had lived about 2 miles from the Bram property since 1925. In his account to social worker Margaret Thompson on October 5, 1981, he stated that William was a strange man who didn't allow anyone near his property. He married a second cousin, Sally, who already had trouble speaking properly. After she died in childbirth of one of the children around 1940, we never saw an adult woman in that house again, just little Eloise growing up. The other children, 2 boys, also never left there. Another pivotal point in the investigation was the testimony of Florence Watson, a midwife who had worked in the region since the 1930s. In her statement on October 12, 1981, she revealed, "I was called to the Bronham property in 1945 to help with the birth of a young woman. When I arrived, I saw it was Eloise, only 13 years old, pregnant and in labor. William didn't let me stay after the baby was born, a boy. I tried to alert the sheriff at the time, but nobody wanted to get involved with the Branhams." The investigation began focusing on reconstructing the chronology of births on the property. Between 1945 and 1963, Eloise apparently gave birth to 6 children, which included the 4 women found in 1981. No formal records existed for any of these births, and the absence of genetic testing at the time made it impossible to determine each child's paternity with certainty. However, the clinical evaluations and collected testimonies pointed toward a disturbing scenario. William Bram had not only abused his own daughter, Eloise, but his sons, Eloise's brothers, apparently continued the incestuous cycle after his death in 1967, resulting in the births of the 4 women. A false lead emerged when investigators speculated the women might belong to an isolationist religious community. This theory was quickly dismissed after consultations with experts on regional religious groups. Another line of inquiry considered a possible involvement with family clans producing moonshine, the illegally distilled liquor common in the region during and after Prohibition, but again, no concrete evidence was found. A major obstacle for the investigation was the sudden death of Martha Bram on October 29, 1981, just 1 month after the case was discovered. The elderly woman died at the county hospital from complications of pneumonia and malnutrition, taking with her many of the answers investigators sought. By November 1981, the official investigation had settled on a predominant theory. William Bram had initiated a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise in the 1940s, leading to the birth of children who, in turn, continued the consanguineous cycle with their own mother and among themselves. The 4 women found in 1981 were the product of this complex genetic intertwining, being simultaneously daughters, sisters, and cousins in a family tree that had folded in on itself. The Owsley County Prosecutor's Office faced an unprecedented dilemma. How could they proceed legally in a case where the main witnesses and potential defendants had severe cognitive limitations or were already deceased? Furthermore, the statute of limitations for many of the crimes had expired, given that the initial abuses dated back to the 1940s. In an internal memo dated December 14, 1981, District Attorney Clarence Hammond wrote, "This case represents not only an unprecedented legal challenge but also a systemic failure of our social and community institutions. While we seek to hold accountable the potential perpetrators still alive, we must recognize that society as a whole failed these women for decades." As the investigation progressed into 1982, significant discoveries began to emerge from the Bram family's silent past. In January of that year, researchers from the University of Kentucky were called to evaluate the case from a broader medical and anthropological perspective. The team, led by Dr. Helen Montgomery, a specialist in population genetics, analyzed medical records and conducted extensive interviews with longtime residents of the region. One of the most revealing documents was located in the local church archives, a baptismal record book containing notes from Pastor Jonathan Williams dated 1935, where he expressed concern about the improper marriage between William Bram and his cousin Sally. The pastor wrote, I visited the Bram family today and found a concerning situation. William and Sally share maternal grandparents, and signs that our ancestors would associate with too much mixed blood are already noticeable in the children. In March 1982, the investigation located a diary belonging to the midwife Florence Watson, who had died in 1979. Within its yellowed pages, they found detailed accounts of the births she had attended at the Bram property between 1945 and 1963. In a particularly disturbing entry from August 1951, she wrote, "I was called again to the Bram house. Little Eloise, now 19 years old, gave birth to her third child. The child presents the same distant eyes as the others. No man besides William and his sons lives on that property. May God have mercy on those children." Florence's diary revealed she had documented 6 births from Eloise, in 1945, 1947, 1951, 1954, 1958, and 1963. The 4 women found in 1981 corresponded to the births of 1951, Agnes, 1954, Mary, 1958, Louise, and 1963, Catherine. There was no mention in more recent records of the first 2 children. A particularly impactful revelation came when the medical team performed cranial radiographs and detailed physical examinations of the 4 sisters. Dr. Samuel Pierce, a specialist in genetic disorders from the University Hospital, observed, "The patterns of bone, facial, and neurological anomalies present in all 4 women are consistent with the accumulation of deleterious recessive genes through multiple generations of inbreeding. Particularly notable are the symmetrical craniofacial malformations present in all of them, suggesting a very close common ancestor." In April 1982, an accidental discovery shed new light on the case. During repair work on a secondary road near the Bram property, workers found bone remains buried in swampy terrain. The forensic analysis, completed in June 1982, identified the remains as belonging to 2 children, approximately 2 and 5 years old, who had been buried at least 30 years prior. Though it was impossible to determine the children's identity with certainty without genetic tests, which would only become available years later, the location and time frame corresponded with Eloise's first 2 children, who were never located. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came through a belated testimony from Harriet Comalms, a social worker who had briefly visited the property in 1967 after an anonymous complaint. In her statement from July 1982, she reported, "I arrived at the property and was greeted by Martha, who prevented me from entering. I could briefly see the interior through the half-open door. I saw several people sitting on the floor, including young women and at least 2 adult men. What impressed me was that they all rocked back and forth in the same rhythm, as if in a trance. Martha said they were just praying their way and that I should respect their religious beliefs." Comalms admitted she did not insist on the inspection and failed to formally record the incident due to pressure from the local community to not interfere in mountain matters. Her late testimony illustrated how cultural isolation and institutional neglect had allowed the cycle of abuse to persist for decades. In August 1982, investigators located a former postal worker who had made deliveries in the region between 1960 and 1975. He reported that William Bram regularly received correspondence from a state institution in Frankfurt, likely related to social or agricultural benefits. This indicated that, despite their isolation, the family maintained minimal contact with government institutions, which however never conducted follow-up visits. A crucial piece of evidence emerged in September 1982 when Dr. Montgomery's team analyzed old community photographs and identified Eloise in a school picture from 1940, her only appearance in official records. The 8-year-old girl already showed subtle physical signs compatible with first-degree consanguinity, suggesting the incestuous cycle may have begun even before her, possibly with her own parents. Throughout these months of investigation, the 4 sisters remained in a state institution for people with cognitive disabilities, where they received proper medical care and basic education for the very first time. Reports from the institution indicated modest but significant progress. After 6 months, Agnes and Mary could communicate with simple phrases and had learned basic self-care tasks. Louise and Catherine, the youngest, demonstrated greater adaptability and learning capacity. Leave in the comments, Never give up on the truth if you believe all missing persons deserve to be found. By the end of 1982, after more than a year of intensive investigation, Kentucky authorities had finally established what became known as the Bram case, one of the most extreme examples of family isolation and continuous inbreeding ever documented in the United States. The story that emerged was more complex and disturbing than the initial assumptions. William Bram, born in 1902, grew up in an isolated Appalachian mining community where marriages between cousins were relatively common due to geographical and cultural isolation. In 1920, he married his second cousin, Sally Jenkins, with whom he had 3 children, Eloise, born in 1932, and 2 boys, Jacob, 1934, and Caleb, 1936. After Sally's death during the birth of a 4th, stillborn child in 1938, William isolated the family even further, moving them to a remote property in Owsley County. It was there, as investigators determined, that he initiated a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise, resulting in the birth of her first child in 1945 when she was only 13 years old. From there, the horror multiplied. Both William and his sons, Jacob and Caleb, maintained incestuous relationships with Eloise, creating a complex genetic web where the subsequent children born were simultaneously siblings, half-siblings, and cousins. Martha, William's mother-in-law and Sally's mother, remained on the property throughout this period, apparently accepting or unable to prevent what was happening. The final legal documents, compiled in December 1982, established the following timeline and genealogy. ****** 1945 ***** birth of Eloise's first child, paternity attributed to William, her own father. This child, a boy, died at age 2 and was buried on the property. ***** 1947 ***** birth of the second child, uncertain paternity between William and Jacob, Eloise's father or brother. This child also died in early childhood. ***** 1951 birth of Agnes, paternity attributed to Caleb, Eloise's brother. ***** 1954 birth of Mary, paternity attributed to Jacob, Eloise's brother. ***** 1958 birth of Louise, paternity possibly attributed to the son born in 1945, Eloise's son and brother, before his death. ***** 1963 birth of Catherine, paternity attributed to William, shortly before his death. The genetic implications were profound. Dr. Samuel Pierce explained in his final report, this case represents an extreme example of multigenerational consanguinity where the coefficient of inbreeding reached levels rarely documented in modern medical literature. The phenotypic manifestations observed in the 4 surviving women are consistent with the homozygotic expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes. In medical terms, the 4 sisters presented a constellation of rare genetic conditions, including moderate microcephaly, characteristic craniofacial deformities, moderate to severe intellectual disability, skeletal anomalies, particularly in the extremities, congenital heart problems in 3 of them, partial hearing loss, and neurological disorders manifested as repetitive movements and communication difficulties. The legal resolution of the case was complicated by several factors. William Bram had died in 1967. Jacob and Caleb, who would have been between 46 and 48 years old in 1982, were never located. Investigators suspected they had also died or left the region years before. Eloise, at 50 years old in 1982, was assessed as severely cognitively compromised and unable to legally answer for her actions. On February 14, 1983, Judge Howard Thornton issued his final decision. Eloise Bram was declared legally incapable and sent to a state institution for long-term care. No formal criminal charges were filed due to the death of the main perpetrators and Eloise's mental state. The 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, became wards of the state of Kentucky, remaining in specialized institutions. The impact of the case on the local community and state institutions was profound. In March 1983, the Kentucky Department of Social Services instituted a new protocol for regular visits to isolated properties, especially in mountainous regions with a history of cultural isolation. State legislation was revised to strengthen child protection and abuse prevention mechanisms. For the small community of Owsley County, the case represented a turning point. The silence that had allowed horror to perpetuate for decades was finally broken. In an April 1983 editorial in the local *Owsley County News*, the editor wrote, "For too long, we have averted our eyes behind the notion of family privacy and mountain autonomy. The Bram case teaches us a painful lesson about the price of silence and collective indifference." Subsequent developments in the case revealed more about the lasting impact of extreme inbreeding. Throughout the 1980s, the four sisters received medical treatments and special education they had never before accessed. The institution's reports documented slow but significant progress. Agnes, the oldest, never developed complete speech but learned basic sign communication and could perform simple tasks with supervision. She died in 1997 from cardiac complications at age 46. Mary demonstrated greater adaptability, learning to read simple words and developing notable artistic abilities. Her drawings, often depicting four female figures holding hands, were preserved by the institution. She died in 2001 at age 47 from a respiratory infection. Louise, considered the most resilient of the four, eventually managed to work on supervised tasks in the institution's laundry and developed basic social relationships with staff and other residents. She died in 2008 at age 50. Catherine, the youngest, showed the most significant cognitive gains after receiving adequate stimulation. In 1990, she was transferred to a supervised residential group environment where she lived until her death in 2012 at age 49. The old Bram property, the scene of decades of horror, was eventually taken by the state due to unpaid taxes. In 1990, the deteriorated structure was demolished, and the area gradually returned to nature. Today, few local residents can identify the exact location where the house stood. In 2002, a discreet memorial was placed in the county cemetery, dedicated to the Bram sisters and all silent victims of isolation and neglect. The plaque bears only four names: Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, without dates or additional details, a silent testimony to lives that almost went entirely unnoticed by society. The legacy of the Bram case endures as a somber reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and institutional neglect. The story of the four sisters from Kentucky has become a case study in social service and medical colleges, illustrating the devastating effects of continued inbreeding and the critical importance of social protection systems. In a retrospective report published in 2010 by the Kentucky Department of Health and Human Services, the commissioner wrote, "The Bram case represents a systemic failure that transcends specific individuals or departments. It was a failure of an entire society to recognize and protect its most vulnerable members. The lessons learned continue to shape our policies and practices to this day." Beyond the medical and legal aspects, the case raises profound questions about community, collective responsibility, and the complicit silence that sometimes allows horror to flourish in the shadows. As Dr. Helen Montgomery observed in her final report on the case, the tragedy of the Bram sisters was not just the result of horrible acts committed by individuals, but also of countless acts of omission by neighbors, officials, and institutions that preferred not to see what was before their eyes. Today, the case remains one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding documented in American medical history, not only for the degree of genetic proximity involved but for the duration of the incestuous cycle over multiple generations. The physical and cognitive characteristics of the four sisters offered researchers rare insights into the cumulative effects of severe endogamy in humans. The most inbred women of Kentucky, as they became known, never knew about the impact their existences would have on medicine, child protection legislation, and public awareness. They lived and died in a limited world, first bounded by the walls of a windowless house, then by the gentler walls of the institutions that finally offered them care. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth." Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who are also interested in real cases that make us reflect on the limits of the human condition.